Well, these are some things to kind of stir up our thinking about what faith is and the place of faith in our lives. We want to go now more to Abraham and Sarah and draw some examples from their lives. And first of all, then, after to talk about the beginning of faith. We read in the scriptures in Genesis chapter 12 and verse 1, the Lord had said to Abraham, leave your country, leave your people, and your father's house, and go to the land I will show you. We're told in Genesis chapter, I believe it's chapter 12 or chapter 11, right at the end, that Abraham came from Ur of the Chaldeans, which many people think is modern-day Iraq. That's where he was born. That's where the life of Abraham began. But yet, as Abraham grew up in a family where he was taught the life of faith, Abraham learned to listen to God and learned to recognize his voice early in his life. And so when God came to him and spoke to him about leaving everything that was familiar to him, leaving his country and leaving his people, leaving his father's house, and to go to a land that God would later show him, the Bible says that Abraham obeyed. Because in his beginnings of learning to trust God, learning to have that faith develop like a muscle, when we use it, it stretches and it grows and it gets larger, it gets stronger. We also need to act upon the little faith that we begin with and childlike faith that God gives to us. So Abraham obeyed. We sang that old hymn this morning. Thanks, Pauline, for bringing us back to trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus than to trust and obey. The beginning of faith. I can't tell you exactly when Abraham started to believe and started to trust and started to have faith in God. And sometimes we, for ourselves, don't know exactly when that starts. But I do know that in a Christian home particularly, as Christian parents, right at the time those little children are small, and they can watch their parents praying at meal times or praying when there are difficult circumstances in life, when they see their parents talking about challenges in their life, but also bringing God into the conversation, they learn that there's more to this life than just what they can see. They learn about faith. They learn about trust, because prayer is all about faith. Otherwise, if it's just a routine that we go through, then it's going to die in our lives. But when there's true trust in a living God who hears and answers and responds to our prayers, not always the way that we want them to be, but the best way for us that they would be, we learn to develop in that faith. And I'd like to just put a strong challenge out to parents. We have a lot of young families in our congregation, thank the Lord. And some of you who were once upon a time a young family know the importance of starting when your children are small, to teach them the life of faith. Yes, you want to see them develop mentally and develop emotionally, develop socially, develop spiritually in every way, but to develop their life of faith, learning to trust in God for the little things of life and the big things of life, the beginning of faith. Secondly, or thirdly, in your list of truths to consider, we want to look at the people of faith, and particularly Abraham and Sarah. Look at them as our examples of faith today. And what we want to really make clear is they were not perfect. They were in no way perfect. I think many of us know parts of this story and maybe all of the story of Abraham and Sarah. Remember that God had come to Abraham and had given him a promise that he would be the father of many nations, and that his offspring would be like the stars of the heavens and the sands of the seashore. But at that point, he had no children. And later on, there were 3 mysterious visitors that came to their place, to their home in Canaan, where they had moved to by God's commandment and God's instructions. And they said now Sarah was getting older, and she was barren. She had not been able to have children, that you're going to have a child. And this is going to be the promised son that was promised to Abraham some years earlier. Abraham was around 75 years of age when he married Sarah. Remember, people lived a little longer in those days, not quite as long as they did in earlier biblical times, into the 900s, but they still lived longer. Sarah lived until she was about 127, and Abraham was 175 when he died. So when he received the promise, he was 75. And the promise wasn't fulfilled until 25 years later when the Bible says that Sarah was past the age of bearing children, and she had been barren, and that she laughed. And when the 3 mysterious visitors commented on her laughing, she lied and said, "I didn't laugh." But you can imagine her laughing, can't you? At that stage of life, when she was about 90 years of age, you can imagine that she was having some trouble believing the promise. It's obvious that they had been trying for a number of years to have children. If my estimates were right as I looked at the story, they're around 25 years trying to have a child. And no child, no pregnancy. There were some other flaws that we see, not only that they doubted God, because, as we know in the story, that one day in her frustration, Sarah said to her husband, Abram at that time, "Why don't you take my servant girl, Hagar, and have a child with her, and have a child for me, because I can't have any children." And we know how that turned out. Jealousy came, and later on, Sarah wanted to kick Hagar out of the house, and the child, Ishmael, who was born some years before Isaac, was born. That was a little Spanish pronunciation that slipped out there. It sometimes does that. And there was great rivalry in the home. And even though we don't have the time this morning to talk about the beginnings of the Islamic faith and the Arab nations, but it all goes back to Ishmael, the son that wasn't the son of promise. And God even gave him a blessing, and he had 12 sons, and from those 12 sons really came the Arab race and the Islamic people. It's a fascinating story, and the conflict that we've had in our world between Christian faith and Islamic faith for so many years, and so many of the battles, the holy wars. But it goes back to the 2 sons of Abraham, Isaac and Ishmael.